everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Noli. If you are new here, I read books, stories, articles, so stay a while and listen. This week, I will be reading Women and Children in Biblical Narrative by Elanore Stump. Wikipedia says that Elanore Stump is an American philosopher who serves as the Robert J. Henle Professor of Philosophy at St. Louis University, where she has taught since 1992. This article in particular comes from the Women's Study Bible, the New King James Version. I also own the New International Version of this Bible. I bought one for my grandmother, I bought one for my sister-in-law, so I highly recommend it if you are a Christian woman or just looking to learn more about Christian philosophy. There are great notes, charts, maps, everything like that. So, without further ado, here is Women and Children in Biblical Narrative by Elanore Stump. Enjoy. In the history of the Christian tradition, biblical commentators have mostly been men. Often, these commentators have been interested in finding, as directly as possible, theological lessons in the Bible texts. Generally, that theological interest prompted a deep and sensitive interpretation of the texts, but sometimes insufficient attention has been given to the details of biblical stories. Stories that involve some human conflict or drama well worth reflecting on from time to time have been treated as if the human details were disposable wrapping on some far more interesting theological lesson. In particular, commentators on biblical stories involving women or children sometimes have seemed uninterested in the roles of the women and children in those stories. If we do not pay attention to all the details in the biblical stories, however, we may well miss important parts of what the Bible has to teach us in those passages. This point is best illustrated with an example. We can see the importance of noticing the women and children in the Bible stories by thinking about one of the most famous biblical stories, Abraham's offering up of Isaac. Many well-known commentators, including Origen and Augustine, Jerome and Aquinas, Nicholas of Lyria, Luther, Calvin, and Kierkegaard, have made interesting and insightful interpretations of this story. Nonetheless, for all their excellence, none of the commentators has satisfactorily answered the basic questions raised by the story. Why did God put Abraham to the test as he did? That is, why would God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? What is praiseworthy about Abraham's willingness to kill his own child? Why should Abraham's consent to destroy his son make him the father of faith? Part of the reason commentators have difficulty answering these questions is that they do not pay sufficient attention in the stories about Abraham to the roles of women and children, except for Isaac, of course. Perhaps some think of Abraham as married to one woman, Sarah, and having one son, Isaac. But in fact, the Bible names for Abraham 3 women as wives or concubines and 8 sons. The stories about these other wives and children are all useful for understanding the offering of Isaac. But the focus of this article is on just one other story, the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. When it looked as if Sarah might never have children, Sarah gave her maid Hagar to Abraham to be his concubine. And in the course of time, Hagar gave birth to a son, Ishmael. Then when Sarah was 90 years old, she did give birth to Isaac. Ishmael was 14 years old at the time of Isaac's birth, and suddenly he had a brother. When Isaac was weaned, no doubt when he was between 2 and 4 years old, Abraham made a great feast. Ishmael was probably around 16 or 17 years old at the time. During the feast, Ishmael mocked Isaac or gave him some other sort of trouble, and Sarah caught him doing so. Sarah had been jealous and violent toward Hagar in the past. At this point, she blew up. She demanded that Abraham expel not only Ishmael, but also Hagar, and she wanted them thrown out into the desert, where they were likely either to die of thirst or be captured and sold for slaves. What Sarah wanted was terrible. Ishmael had been Abraham's only child for more than 14 years, and Hagar had been part of this complicated family for even longer. Throwing them out was a terrible betrayal of the love and trust that must have existed between Abraham and his teenaged boy, and between Abraham and Hagar. Both Abraham and Sarah must have known that what Sarah demanded would likely prove to be the death of Hagar and Ishmael. That Abraham was willing even to consider doing what Sarah wanted shows how ferocious her wrath must have been. But even so, Abraham could not bring himself to agree to her demands. At this point, God intervened in the struggle between Abraham and Sarah, very surprisingly by siding with murderously angry Sarah. Although Sarah's intentions were bad, the result she wanted, that only Isaac should count as Abraham's heir, was the result that God had foreordained all along. So God sided with Sarah, but he went contrary to Sarah's bad intentions because he again promised to make Ishmael a great nation. So what Sarah saw as a way of ruining Ishmael and getting rid of him, God promised to turn into a way of making Ishmael something glorious. God's promise, then, relieved Abraham of the burden of betraying the trust between him and his son and between him and his concubine. Abraham could send them out into the desert without thinking that he was furthering Sarah's plan to destroy them. He could also explain God's promise to Hagar and Ishmael. He could make clear to them that by giving in to Sarah, he was not acting in a way to bring about their deaths or even their ruin, because God was guaranteeing his protection and blessing upon their lives. God's promise let Abraham give in to Sarah without being guilty of a moral wrong. Abraham trusted God's promise to make of Ishmael a great nation. If Abraham had not believed God's promise when the lives of Ishmael and Hagar were at stake, then Abraham would have been guilty of betraying their trust and harming them. As a result of God's promise, Abraham stopped struggling with himself over whether to do what Sarah wanted, and he assented to her demands. He rose up early in the morning and sent Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert with only a loaf of bread and a bottle of water. That would be a terrible way to treat your son and his mother, unless you believed God's promise to make them into something glorious in the desert. On the other hand, contrast Abraham's reaction to this promise of God with other occasions on which Abraham talked to God. When God promised Abraham a biological offspring, Abraham asked for a sign to confirm the truth of the promise. On that occasion, when the issue was abandoning Hagar and Ishmael in the desert, Abraham did not ask for any sign to reassure him of their safety. When what was at stake was the lives of total strangers in Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham bargained with God. Where the lives of his son and concubine were at risk, Abraham did not bargain in any of the ways he might have done. He did not ask God whether he might accompany Hagar and Ishmael to some oasis, or whether he might send a convoy of servants to set up Hagar and Ishmael to be self-supporting by giving them herds and flocks. He just sent Ishmael and Hagar to walk off into the desert with less than a full day's provision of food and water. Even given the reassurance of God's promise, there was something distressing about the readiness with which Abraham acquiesced to Sarah's demands that he throw out his concubine and his son. The next and last recorded episode during which God came to talk to Abraham was the offering of Isaac. The age of Isaac is not clear at this point, but he was old enough to carry a substantial load of wood up a mountain, while still being young enough to be quite diffident toward his father. To suppose that he was teenaged, maybe 16 or 17, around the age of Ishmael at the time when Abraham abandoned Ishmael and Hagar in the desert, is not unreasonable. At the outset of God's message to Abraham on this occasion was an elaborate identification of Isaac. Your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Genesis 22, verse 2. The phrase, your only son, is striking. If you had abandoned one of your two boys in the desert, would you be able to hear that phrase, your only son, without wincing and immediately thinking of Ishmael? And if the person who guaranteed you the safety of the son you abandoned then used the expression, your only son, to refer to Isaac, wouldn't you immediately think of the boy you had abandoned and wonder in what sense Isaac was an only son? The content of God's message is enough to turn a father's heart to stone. Take your only son, that is the only son you have left, and offer him up as a burnt offering. But think of the expulsion of Ishmael again. God had told Abraham to act in a way that seemed likely to bring about Ishmael's death, except for God's promise to make Ishmael a great nation. Because Abraham believed the promise about Ishmael, he could abandon Ishmael in the desert without fear of harm to his son. However reasonable it would otherwise seem to believe that Ishmael would die out in the desert with only a little food and water. Now God was requiring the sacrifice of Isaac, but Abraham also had a promise from God about Isaac. God had also promised to make Isaac a great nation. If God is good and his promises are trustworthy, then Isaac would have children who would count as Abraham's descendants, inherit the land of Canaan, and increase greatly in number. But when God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac was still a boy without children of his own. If Isaac died, God's promises about him would not have been true. Put another way, if God's promises are trustworthy, then Isaac would not die in his youth, however reasonable it seemed to think that he would. In the case of Ishmael, family life was made much easier for Abraham if he believed that God's promises are true. Trusting God's promises gave him a good reason to give in to his furious wife Sarah. Now things were different. Doing what looked certain to bring about the death of Isaac was as strongly opposed to Abraham's self-interest as it could be. But if Abraham had not trusted God's promise about Isaac, what will we think looking back on Abraham's behavior toward Ishmael? Won't we think that his apparent trust in God's promise then was just an excuse, a rationalization for taking the easy way out where Sarah was concerned? If he refused to entrust Isaac to God's promise, although he was willing to abandon Ishmael on the strength of God's promise, won't we think that, after all, there was something terrible about his willingness to expel Ishmael? In asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, God was, in effect, asking Abraham what he would have done on that earlier occasion if it had been Isaac instead of Ishmael. Abraham had to trust God's promise and acknowledge his goodness, or he had to make clear that in the expulsion of Ishmael, he was just using God's promise as a convenient excuse for doing a wrong action. This trial, then, would refine Abraham. Whichever way he acted, this time he would have to act out of unmixed motives. Abraham's options were to refuse to do what looked likely to bring about the death of Isaac, because he did not, after all, trust in God's promise, or to be willing to sacrifice Isaac, believing that, in doing so, he would not bring about Isaac's death, because he believed in God's promise to make of Isaac a great nation. Abraham passed the test. He treated Isaac as he treated Ishmael. In this case, too, he rose up early in the morning and obeyed God's command. Treating the two cases in the same way required believing that even if he sacrificed Isaac, Isaac would live and flourish and be the source of a great nation. Is there anything too hard for God? So, Abraham passed the test just by virtue of believing that in sacrificing Isaac, he would not be bringing Isaac's life to an end because God is good and his promises are trustworthy. In this way of seeing the story, Abraham's line to the servant is not a polite fib. "Stay here with the donkey," he told them. "The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Genesis 22, verse 5. Similarly, when he told Isaac, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, in Genesis 22, verse 8, he was not engaging in tender deception or unconsciously cruel irony, as he would be doing if he thought he were going off to kill Isaac. Here, too, Abraham believed what he said. Nonetheless, although he believed, Abraham might still have been in anguish as he said these lines. Think about a man who discovers while mountain climbing with his son that the only way to safety lies across a large crevice. If he did not believe his son could make it, he would not ask him to leap. But the father may be bathed in sweat, with years taken off his life by the time the boy makes it over. The test God set for Abraham was a hard and painful one. But Abraham's ready acquiescence to Sarah's demand to abandon Hagar and Ishmael in the desert made this test a good and right one for Abraham. What Hebrews 11 says about Abraham presupposes this way of reading the story too. Abraham acted on faith in offering up Isaac because he believed that the offering of Isaac did not invalidate the promises of God, since God could even raise Isaac from the dead. Hebrews 11, verse 17 to 19. Once again, God's verdict on Abraham is that Abraham had passed the test. As he raised the knife over Isaac, God told Abraham, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." What God said is just right if Abraham had refused to trust Isaac to God after having been willing to expel Ishmael on God's promise. He would have been mocking rather than fearing God, acting as if God did not matter or did not mind much about the death of innocent children. But until Abraham had to choose whether or not to trust Isaac to God, perhaps no one could have known whether Abraham feared God because Abraham's motives in the case of Ishmael were confused and mixed together. God knew. The trial over Isaac refined Abraham's character because Abraham believed in God's goodness and the trustworthiness of God's promise. Abraham was willing to trust his son, his only son, to God. That is why Abraham is the father of faith. If we remember Hagar and Ishmael when we read the story of the offering of Isaac, we can answer the questions that often arise in connection with that story. The expulsion of Ishmael makes it clear why God should try Abraham and why the test should take the form it did. What is at issue in the test was whether Abraham would believe in God's goodness in Isaac's case as well as in Ishmael's. What is praiseworthy about Abraham, what makes him the father of faith, is not his readiness to kill his child to please God. It is his willingness to trust in God's goodness and to believe God's promises, even when, apparently, those promises would surely turn out to be false. What makes Abraham the father of faith is not just that he believed in God's existence or that he was obedient to God. He did believe in God's existence and he was obedient. What makes him the father of faith, however, was his belief that God is good and thus would never break his promises to his people. If we focus only on Abraham or Abraham and Isaac, as many interpreters do, and if we are not willing to pay serious and careful attention to the various women and children in the narrative, we will miss all of this side of the story about the offering of Isaac. As a result, we could have a much harder time understanding why God would have asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, and it would be more difficult to grasp the sort of faith the Bible is recommending to us here. The same point applies to many other passages in the Bible as well. If we think carefully about the women and the children in those stories, we will see a side of the story important for our understanding of the Bible's message, which we would have missed otherwise. Thanks for watching and listening. So, what do you think? Does focusing on women in the narrative of the Bible really expand the conversation of the Bible's philosophy? Further, would inclusion in the narrative change the misogynistic viewpoints that are ever present in the Abrahamic religions today? As a woman, I can personally say that I have felt alienated by other men within my religion. I've questioned, why do I even follow this religion, attend church? I know I believe in God, maybe that's enough, but sometimes it's hard to see where exactly I fit in the Christian context when the views of some individuals are so negative toward women. To me, seeing the narrative from a female perspective is important. Opinions are formulated by information. And when you have more information, you are better able to formulate an opinion, whether it be on women, men, what have you. When you have more information from the viewpoint of a woman, you are more empowered, not just as a woman, but as a man as well. That's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. Take care. I love you. Bye-bye.